Welcome back, everybody, to our weekly immigration news recap. I'm happy to be joined today by Guerra. I'll let Gil introduce himself in just a minute, but we're recording this today on Thursday, June 5th at 12:47 p.m. Eastern time. Gil, I always give the timestamp on the recording because while we release these on Friday morning, it's pretty typical the last couple of weeks that some brand new breaking news update comes out between now and then. So even though this is a weekly immigration news recap, we reserve the right to cover anything that comes out between now and the end of day Friday next week.
Right,
Um,
that's very wise.
Today, we're going to be just covering two main topics. One, the ongoing saga that we've touched on in the last couple of weeks on sort of the targeting of F1 students through a variety of policies and actions from the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security. That's something that Gil's been following very closely and has been writing about. So I'm happy to have him here to sort of break down some of the issues he's been looking at. And then the big breaking news from last night was that the Trump administration announced a new entry ban that we'll dig into at least a little bit with what information we have and what context we can provide from the past few entry and travel bans that the Trump administration has instituted. So first, Gil, I'll let you introduce yourself here. And I know you're an immigration policy analyst at the Niskanen Center. You write, occasionally for Foreign Policy Magazine, The Dispatch. Tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, your background, and your areas of focus.
Sure. So, the area that I focus on in particular is oftentimes kind of the intersection between foreign policy and immigration. I think that's an area that has historically played a really large role in shaping US immigration policy. I think if you think to how our refugee policies worked during the Cold War, for example, played a really outsized role. I think the role has maintained relevance throughout the modern era. I think it played, maybe more of a subtle role perhaps, following global war and terror, et cetera. But I think, right now what we're really seeing so many times, for me, when we're talking about these cases, whether it's, why is Harvard having its status revoked? Why are Chinese students in particular being targeted? Why were some countries put on this list for the entry ban and not? I think that it's really important to have an understanding also of foreign policy and some of the kind of both bilateral and multilateral dynamics and our general geopolitical considerations to actually get the entire full picture of some of these decisions and of their ramifications and how they might change in the future.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I'm really glad to have you here because I think sometimes the busy immigration attorneys that listen to this podcast don't have the time to sort of do a full deep dive on the geopolitical drivers of a lot of the policies that are impacting their clients and their day-to-day work right now. And I think under the Trump administration, it's probably more relevant than ever with some folks with really strong, long-standing ideological points of view, like the current Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and sort of what the policies that have trickled out from the State Department since he's taken over, and sort of what the background of those are. We'll jump into all of that in just a second. Just to sort of set the stage for our first topic, Gail, and I want to share some of the comments that have been made by Trump administration officials on it in the last week because I had to do some digging to find them. I don't think they were covered in mass media very well, so I want to share those with the audience. But over the past 5 months, right, there's been a steady, deliberate tightening of policies targeting specifically F1 visa holders, both students and professionals working on OPT and STEM OPT. All started in April. There was sort of that mass wave of SEVIS revocations for F1 students across the country. There was some great journalism from Inside Higher Ed that was tracking that and reporting that. That sort of saga lasted for a couple weeks, and there's a lot of legal battles over it. Ultimately, a lot of the SEVIS records were reinstated for students, but shortly after that, I began at the end of April. I began hearing reports about ICE terminating work authorization for OPT holders as opposed to just for students actively in classes or enrolled at university. But that news got buried last week, which because there was a whole wave right around this area. So first, and you wrote about this, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in just a minute. DHS announced that they're suspending Harvard's ability to enroll foreign students. There's been there was an immediate legal challenge against that, and that's continuing to to play itself out. A couple days later, Nahal Tuzi from Politico got a State Department cable leak to her that revealed that the State Department was instructing all consulates to pause new visa appointments for F, J, and M visa holders. So students, and then J is a whole bunch of different
Uh-huh.
researchers, professionals, things like that, and M as well. And State Department didn't publicly comment on that, so it was very unclear for the past couple of days. And I'll show a clip of the State Department spokesperson being asked about that. And then towards the end of the week, last week, Secretary of State Mark Rubio announced his plans to revoke visas for some Chinese nationals who have affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party or studying and working in certain fields. And again, that's a topic you wrote about, so I
Uh-huh.
want to get your thoughts on it. So that's sort of just setting the stage, right, of all the things that have happened in just the past couple of weeks around this area. Oh, and final one. This one I didn't catch until I dug a little bit for it, but Trump during a press conference kind of as like an offhanded comment floated the idea of a nationwide 15% enrollment cap for foreign students at all universities, which like might just be flippant for right now, but also could be potentially, the making of a policy behind the scenes by Stephen Miller and his team that could get rolled out in a couple weeks. So that's the stage setting. Gil, I just want to share my screen and play a couple of clips from government officials who have spoken to these issues, because other than last week, I hadn't heard a ton of official comment on it. It really had just been talked about behind the scenes. First up was the Department of State spokesperson, Tammy Bruce, being asked about the suspension of new appointments for F1 and FM and J visa holders. So I'll play that real quick, and then we can get your reaction if you have one.
Go back to the student visa issue, leaving aside the issue of the cable. The secretary himself has said that the vast majority of students in the country, of foreign students, have done nothing wrong. They shouldn't be worried about their visas. They're welcome to study at American universities. People going to universities this fall, foreign students, should they be concerned that their visas won't be processed in time? Do you think that is the State Department confident that people can still attend autumn semesters?
Well, this is every dynamic, and again, we don't speak about individual visa cases. We don't speak about the nature of the choices made about individuals. We do know, though, that we take very seriously the process of vetting who it is that comes into the country. And we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to vet, and we continue to have an interest. Again, whether they be student or if you're a tourist who needs a visa or whoever you are, we're going to be looking at you. I think it seems to be such a controversial thing that's going on, but it shouldn't be. And every nation should take seriously, and does, who's coming in. So
Gil, I'll stop it there. Sort of two things. One, there's been a consistent, messaging framework from the entire Trump administration around vetting for this issue, which Tammy Bruce hits on there. And two, she doesn't reference the State Department leaked cable specifically, but that was what the question was about. And the idea of pausing appointments for those specific visa applicants in order to pursue additional vetting measures, she mentions as not being controversial. So do you have any thoughts on that in particular?
Sure. I mean, I'm kind of interested. Again, there's a security rationale here behind it that I think oftentimes is the easiest one to make. I almost would have expected there to be some more high-profile cases of, maybe international students being involved in some of the protests, and particularly kind of disruptive actions that we've seen. I'm sure that to some degree some of them have been, but I also think that it's not really an honest interpretation to say that the campus protests that we've seen, regardless of what you think of them, and I have a pretty negative view of them, have been fueled by international students or have really been, promulgated by students who are coming in sort of as these outside agitators. And it's something that I think because of the recent actions that we've seen towards Chinese students in particular, they've kind of become, I think, sort of the face of international students in some ways. Of when we think now in the popular media, who's going to be impacted by this, it's oftentimes stories about Chinese students. But according to the Open Doors data from the most recent year, the largest group are now students from India. who again are students that we don't necessarily think of in the same kind of security and securitized way. And in many cases, again, the vice president's first trip outside of the country was to India. It's very much a country that we're trying to cultivate a relationship with. And so, these sorts of, blanket bans of, pausing all of these new applications, regardless of nationality. Again, it's not just that it's something that I think could actually be harming our enemies. It's oftentimes for so many of these countries, if you are, especially, say a young leader in India and you're, from the kind of section of society that is going to go on to do important things politically in India in the future, and your primary experience at a formative age with the United States is not, oh wow, I got to go to Harvard and I had a great time there. I learned so much about American culture. I'm going to come back to the United States now with an appreciation of what the United States is. It's now going to be, well, I had this horrible experience of sort of uncertainty, right? In my time trying to study the United States, and my entire time there was kind of clouded by this atmosphere of suspicion and of fear. And I think, a lot of the world interprets us. I think we think of ourselves very idealistically, and we think of ourselves as acting on very ideological motives. I think a lot of the rest of the world, which I'm sure you know, as having lived abroad, sees this very kind of more in realist terms of acting in kind of self-interest. And I think this kind of also confirms that perception, oftentimes for international students who are going through this. It's very much sort of, you can't trust the United States. It's sort of a fickle partner in this. And also, again, I had this experience trying to study there, and my, opinion is now going to be very different than it would have been. So again, there are always these framings of who does it harm if we have, this pause in this vetting? Like, what is the actual concrete harm? And I think because soft power is so nebulous and so impossible to actually quantify, we oftentimes just dismiss it out of hands. And it's also long term, right? So these people will not be in office likely, by the time these consequences do roll around. But I do think that there are real consequences. And I think that's oftentimes obscured by statements like that.
Yeah, I think you hit on sort of two key points there. One is that the stated motivation for these policies by the administration have been, based around campus protests, is one example you gave, and secondarily, we'll talk about this in a minute. Sort of the geopolitical threat of, losing IP to China, for example, with having Chinese foreign students potentially come over and studying in the U.S. But the actions so far have been broad for the most part, pausing visa appointments across the board for all F students, all J, applicants, and M applicants, impacts, significantly more people than the small percentage that, at least in the public statements of these folks, of the Trump administration, are the driver of these policies. And that goes into the second clip that I want to play from President Trump himself, speaking offhand. I think it was at a White House event, where he was asked about Harvard specifically, and the ongoing saga between the Trump administration and Harvard around foreign students. So it's a really short clip. It's vague, but I'll share it anyway because I think it's important to hear, and then I'll get your reaction.
These countries aren't helping us. They're not investing in Harvard and all of we are. So why would 31%, why would a number so big? I think, number one, I think they should have a cap of maybe around 15%, not 31%. We have people who want to go to Harvard and other schools. They can't get in because we have foreign students there. But I want to make sure that the foreign students are people that can love our country.
So, Gail, that sort of touches on one of the points you just made about like the broader geopolitical implications of these policies, and how the cultural exchange aspect of it might be impacted by some of the broader policies that have already been put in place, and then potential policies that President Trump just laid out around additional restrictions and caps on the number of foreign students that can come to the U.S. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. This is really interesting for me because before I worked in the think tank space, I worked in college admissions. I went to a small liberal arts college on the East Coast for undergrad, and I worked for all 4 years there in the admissions office. And I was working, basically at a different think tank and something that was very proximate to college admissions. And so I think that, having spent a lot of time talking with students, also seeing the trends. There are real crises that we have, especially with young men who are going, or rather not going to college, increasingly at the same rates that young women are. I think that the college admissions process is incredibly stressful now for students, for a number of reasons. COVID had a big impact on how schools determine this. There's now very much kind of a shotgun approach to applications. So you have to apply to more and more schools, just to have a chance of getting in somewhere. There's a lot of controversy now around affirmative action, et cetera. And, to what degree the process is merit based. But I do think that it's false to pin the blame of this on international students and on the rise of international students. I mean, it is true that there is somewhat of an incentive to admit them because they oftentimes pay full tuition rates. But the reality of that is, again, and this is, I think, sort of a common heuristic error that is, made by this administration is, sort of seeing this as kind of a fixed pool of slots, and not realizing that, actually, if you have more students who are paying full tuition, you can have more students like myself who are getting need-based financial aid and who are actually also able to attend the school. It's not as if, all of that money necessarily just goes towards, enriching the coffers of these, academic bureaucrats who they hate. Although obviously, some of it does. It actually also creates more opportunities, I think, for American students. And I think that's, sort of the fault oftentimes of, perhaps administrators to some degree of not kind of communicating those benefits. Again, the real communication problem that I think that people on the pro-immigration side have is that, the benefits of immigration are very diffuse. They're very spread out. They're big in scale, but they're also long term. And so it's really hard to tell someone and to really make them actually kind of conclusively see, well, actually, you're able to go to this college on this scholarship because there are X, Y, and Z number of international students who are kind of subsidizing your tuition by virtue of them being the ones who are paying more. If anything, they're kind of getting a raw deal. In that it's much harder to get a need-based scholarship at a competitive school if you're an international student. And it's actually, easier, much easier to do that if you're an American student. And it's also, again, just kind of an example of how the numbers, I think, are oftentimes really arbitrarily picked. I think that, and we'll probably come back to this at some points, but we like to imagine there's kind of this intentionality behind some of these numbers, that there's, some sort of scientific formula of, why 15%? Well, I mean, very clearly it's just because it's half of 30. All right. And if your starting number is 30, and if you want to say in very simple ways, I'm reducing it by half, then you get 15%. And again, that might sound kind of ridiculous to people like you and me, and perhaps the listeners of this podcast, but that is why, their communications have worked much better, because they're so simple and easy to understand, even if ultimately it leads to bad policy.
Yeah, and I want to just jump straight ahead. I had a clip from Stephen Miller that I wanted to share, but I think it's just sort of redundant to some of the points we've been hitting on already, where he sort of speaks about the administration's motivations behind instituting some of these policies. And in their view, they do frame them as in a, I think, uh, a simple and digestible way for their constituency of why they're taking the actions that they're taking. Well, you wrote a piece recently for Foreign Policy, and I'll share it here. And as I am, feel free to sort of start to recap it for the audience, where you really did an analysis and looked at what the practical impact of specifically revoking Chinese student visas would be. So do you want to go ahead and maybe just give a recap of this article, and we'll link it in the show notes so that readers can or so that listeners can read it as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And, basically I'm starting and I'm trying to kind of quantify the impact of this. They had very vague criteria that they set out.
Right.
But for me, one of the things I'm always interested in, again, we have these ambiguous guidelines, but how do we actually determine what's the impact and what the scope of this could be? So, we're starting, it covers students from China and Hong Kong. So that's, about 283,000 students overall. There have been a few studies of how many of those students are likely in STEM. And so I'm assuming that, the number of students from Hong Kong who are in STEM are similar to the number of students from China, that rate hasn't, fluctuated much. Perhaps it has, perhaps it hasn't. But, we can assume that maybe about 47% of them are going to be in STEM, or possibly in what we might consider a critical field, or what might be delineated by the administration as a critical field. And those were the two components in this order by Marco Rubio and the Secretary of State. It was some sort of affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party, and potentially being part of this critical field network. So again, if we're just going to assume in the broadest possible sense that anything related to STEM is going to be on this list, and that's already almost half. And then you also consider what does affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party actually look like? And I very much understand and am sympathetic to, and I'm myself very hawkish on China. And so I understand, the rationale of we don't want people who are going to come here, study things that could potentially harm the U.S. national interest, and come back with it. Again, the question for me, from a foreign policy perspective, it's really sort of twofold. First, just on the merits of it, what does affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party actually mean? And how ideologically committed are these people oftentimes? About 7% of China's population are members of the CCP. It's oftentimes kind of an avenue for economic advancements and for professional development also. So if you're coming from a background where you're going to wind up studying in the United States and you're from China, you probably are more likely to have a parent with CCP affiliation, and you're also very likely to be parts of things like the Youth Communist League. Throughout your younger years, etc., that could also be counted for this. These are all sort of seen as almost necessary but not sufficient memberships to have in order to have a good success in China for your own career, right? And so there's sort of this question of if we expand that out, that's almost certainly going to be a majority. The number that I arrived at, assuming that there's going to be some overlap between STEM and CCP affiliation, is about 150,000 or so students who are possibly going to be impacted by this. Of that, 283,000. So that's a majority there. One of the things that I'm a little concerned about from a kind of a US perspective also is that the Chinese have this idea and this image of us that everything we do is really intentional. Again, they assume, and this is how they think of themselves, and so they kind of see it in us, that every small step and action we take was deliberate. We bombed their embassy on accidents in Belgrade once in the 90s, during NATO operations there, and they are still very angry about that. They're still convinced that was an intentional act, and we did to kind of knock them down a peg and put them back in their place during that moment. I don't think that we have the ability, one, to determine, of these students, how many of them are actually possibly the children of officials who might be more sympathetic towards us, in U.S.-China relations. Some of these officials are going to be dubs within the party, or are possibly people who we could use and have leverage over in the future, and saying, hey, if you want to support American interests and say trade negotiations, which are currently ongoing, etc., your kid gets to graduate from Harvard and doesn't have, the life that they've built here uprooted, and also continues to go on and have the kind of career they want, etc. That's a really powerful tool for us to have. And, I think by mass expelling them, by not having, any kind of carve outs, and again, a lot that we really can do at scale with the way that this order is phrased, it could be, not only, actually destabilizing to a large degree in U.S.-China relations and harmful to us from the human capital level. I think it also really, again, create grudges and feelings of ill will that will last a lifetime. If you think back to your time, in college or your education, I'm pretty sure if you had gotten kicked out of your university, by an administration, you would have negative feelings towards that administration for a very long time. And towards that country, right, for a very long time. So again, like these are things that there is a security framework there. I want to be very clear that I'm not totally unsympathetic towards that framework, and I think there have been other things that we've done that I talk about in the paper that were continued by the Biden administration, also because they made sense to do so. But it's really more about taking a scalpel, I think, than basically endangering almost every student to some degree who's currently studying here.
Yeah, and I'm glad you sort of quantified the numbers in the piece, or at least made an estimate based off of the vague description that that was in Secretary of State Rubio's initial announcement. And we'll see if there's additional specifics that come from that in coming weeks. I've heard from folks that this announcement and the vagary is intentional. It's sort of it's a attempt to see what the reaction is, and sort of what the ramifications might be before they actually put pen to paper and turn this into a policy that has real, yeah, sort of practical next steps. You hit on a lot of interesting stuff there, and I think an important downstream aspect of this is hundreds of thousands of Chinese students are currently studying in the U.S. Up to potentially 150,000 of them are at risk potentially of having their visas revoked. Um, Set aside the fact that these types of actions and this type of uncertainty is without a doubt going to have an impact on the number of foreign student enrollment we see in the coming years. There's a big pipeline of foreign students who attend U.S. universities who then go and work at U.S. companies in key positions, especially in STEM fields, right? Are a part of the growth of and innovation at those companies, and another subset that spin off and oftentimes go and start their own companies, right? Or their own products that then become quintessential American companies that we'll all hear about in 15 years and talk about what great immigration stories they are, right? And the immigration attorneys that listen to this podcast are the ones who are advising those companies on what the prospect of being able to hire a Chinese student who maybe they gave an offer to after a summer, junior year summer internship to for the next year. They're advising them on what these policies actually mean for their ability to be able to hire them, because most of these students, because of the restrictions of the H-1B cap lottery, need to be able to continue to work for up to 3 years on F1 OPT and STEM OPT, which side note, but according to Joseph Edlow in his nomination hearing to be USCIS director, also is going to apparently face some additional scrutiny under his leadership of the agency. So I think the question I have for you on this is for immigration practitioners specifically, and you've been a keen observer of the political conversation around these issues for the last several years. How do practitioners, in your view, distinguish between statements that are made purely for not political theater, but also maybe sort of a strategic, diplomatic play against an adversary like China, versus policy announcements that have some real legs underneath them and might turn into something that is codified and then enacted and enforced by the immigration agencies?
Right. That's a great question. And I mean, it's especially difficult to tell because I think, to use just examples from the past few months, I think if you were to have looked at, say, South Africans coming into the U.S. refugee program, initially you might have said, okay, well, that's clearly just sort of a symbolic gesture. But actually, there was a lot of effort, and obviously we did have actual arrivals from white South African farmers, and that policy did wind up being implemented. So partially, I think, it can kind of be kind of understood as, who actually has power within the administration to actually move and block things. So obviously with South Africans, it was Elon Musk largely. I think you can reasonably infer that was kind of a big part of that calculus. But you can look at what hasn't happened, or at least what so far has stalled. One of those big proposals right now is the gold card. Where according to Howard Lutnick, we've been 2 weeks away from it for several months now. They've got a website.
He's already sold 10,000. He said.
Right, exactly. We've already sold 10,000, right? And there are some like very excited people out there, who are just like raring to buy them. But again, like realistically, I think part of it is kind of looking at, how would they actually go about implementing this, and what kind of pathway is there, and also again, what kind of potential resistance is there within the administration, towards this. And we know that, from what we have heard from Republicans on the Hill, from meetings that they've had that have been leaked, there's a lot of resistance to the gold card there. I'm very confident that a lot of more restrictionist voices in the administration are also not a fan of selling citizenship for 5 million either. Again, it's a very sort of complex operation that you'd have to essentially, again, be very creative with what authorities you use, whether it's reforming the EB-5 or doing something else, or trying to do it through Congress, et cetera, to do it. I guess it's a lot more convoluted. Things like this, as far as, blocking these visas, whether it be legal challenges, yes, of course. But it's also more simple. It's also, I think, more straightforwardly in the remit of the executive branch here. And it's something that, again, is it probably going to be affected by our trade negotiations with China? Absolutely. And right now, President Trump is trying very hard to get a call with Xi Jinping that is, as of the time of recording, has yet to materialize. But yes, there probably will be a lot of volatility here, especially because, again, I think it will be used kind of as a stick to some degree. And I think that's, why some of the other things that we've discussed, some of the other options have been, again, very broad. This one was left intentionally vague, I think, to kind of give us some flexibility and some leeway vis-a-vis China. And, honestly, one of the best predictors for it will be kind of watching U.S.-China relations in that sense, and actually sort of looking at that as kind of an indicator and a predictor of whether or not this will actually go through. If it does, to what scale it will go through. I really, I was interested that when it was announced, for example, sometimes they'll announce these and they'll immediately have like high profile cases, right? And there was sort of a high profile security incident with some Chinese researchers, and potentially an agricultural risk with a sample they were working on when they entered the country recently. But that happened after this. There was no sort of accompanying, well, here's the son or daughter of a high ranking CCP official that we don't like, and we're deporting them, and we're making a spectacle out of deporting them. And the White House X account is tweeting Studio Ghibli-fied versions of it on their Twitter. It was not accompanied to at least any public high profile releases yet. Again, those may come with time, but at least for now, it's something that I think, again, we'll expect to see at least some, but much of it will be contingent upon the state of U.S.-China relations in the next few weeks.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So for immigration attorneys, subscribe to Foreign Policy Magazine and read Gil's work.
Yeah, there you go. This is all very self-serving, right?
No, it's. I think I've been making this point publicly and privately with a lot of the immigration attorneys that I've spoken with, because I was immigration paralegal at one of the big corporate immigration firms during the last Trump administration, and before that I was in the think tank world in DC, and the level of sophistication both on the communication, um, uh, both in their communication and then in their actual implementation of policy changes on the immigration front has become far better than the last time around in this administration. Like you mentioned, typically when they roll out a new policy, they have a specific political example, a high profile political example that they put front and center, and then in the fine print, they have sort of their legal rationale behind doing it. And both of those things are far more potent than they were in the first Trump administration when they tried to institute, for example, public charge, and the whole rollout was confusing, and they really didn't understand the regulatory process that they were dealing with. They didn't have the people in place to push that agenda forward. It was just messy. Yeah, there's still a lot of legal challenges against their policy agenda when it comes to immigration, but I think they have a much better understanding now of how the government works. That's a good segue into our next topic, which is really the big news of the day. To a degree, we've known it's been coming for a while now, but the entry ban was announced by President Trump last night in both a video and then also in a lengthy proclamation document that was released on the White House website. So I'm just going to play a quick clip of President Trump announcing this.
That's why on my first day back in office, I directed the Secretary of State to perform a security review of high-risk regions and make recommendations for where restrictions should be imposed. Among the national security threats their analysis considered are the large-scale presence of terrorists, failure to cooperate on visa security, inability to verify travelers' identities, inadequate record keeping of criminal histories, and persistently high rates of illegal visa overstays, and other things.
So hold there for a minute, because the first four reasons he listed for this entry ban going into effect are all in your wheelhouse of geopolitics, and the last was very specific on visa overstays. That in itself is an issue that Trump administration officials have been talking about for a decade at this point, and other immigration. I wouldn't call them hawks, just other observers of immigration have been worried about for a very long time, but came into front and center public attention over the weekend with the terrorist attack in Boulder, which was conducted by somebody who had overstayed their visa and over extended their work authorization. But Doug Rand, who's a former senior advisor to the director of USCIS, just had a really interesting LinkedIn post about this topic in particular. And I'm just going to share a snippet of it, and then I'll put the full LinkedIn post in the show notes so people can go and read it themselves. So Doug, and just again, I'll quickly show this, and then I'll link the post in the show notes so people can go and read it in full themselves. But Doug just pointed out that sort of the reasoning behind this travel ban, in addition to all the reasons that the president listed in his statement, is they're targeting countries that are have foreign nationals who tend to be the biggest perpetrators of visa overstays, right? And he includes a chart in here around sort of the number of visa overstays from each of those countries, which is data that U.S. Customs and Border Protection tracks and releases public reports on. And essentially, Doug's argument here is just that, like, the justification on this particular point has some issues for various reasons. So I think in general, this particular rendition of the entry ban is a lot more geopolitical. What do you think about it, Gil?
I think that, one of the things that I was really interested in, and this is going to sound incredibly niche, I was really surprised that Nicaragua was not on this list. In large part because so much of, the policy around Latin America is kind of, it revolves around, this troika of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela that have historically been our primary antagonists in the region. And if you think, obviously, Kelly Greenhill, professor at Tufts and MIT, has a great book on this called Weapons of Mass Migration. One of the main case studies that she looks at is on how Cuba has historically weaponized migration towards the United States. More recently, what's really interesting for me is that throughout the Biden administration, the country that has weaponized migration, I would say the most intentionally and the most blatantly was Nicaragua, in that they lessened or loosened their visa requirements for a number of nationalities, particularly in Africa and in Central Asia, to get migrants from outside of the hemisphere to the U.S. border to basically complicate things for us. We announced many travel and visa sanctions on Nicaraguan officials during the Biden administration. We've announced new ones under the Trump administration as well. That being said, Nicaragua has taken really painstaking steps to demonstrate that they've stopped doing that as soon as Trump won office. And they've also been accepting a lot of deportation flights every month, and they've really facilitated that. So that for me was sort of interesting to see in this lens of, kind of, you have these three countries that are almost always kind of treated in a bucket within the hemisphere, at least, again, in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. There are issues, obviously, that are kind of unique to each one and how they've used their immigration relationships with the U.S. The lobbies, I think, of the diaspora for each one are also very different. I'm sure there are differences in visa overstays there, but the fact that Nicaragua there was excluded from this list, for me, was also just a really interesting marker of what kind of metrics they actually did use, and again, what kind of geopolitical considerations they also used there. Another thing to kind of consider, I'm sure that the diaspora populations from Venezuela and Cuba will not be happy, who are oftentimes kind of the dissidents here. One other major difference, though, between them that may indicate that there was some sort of thought behind this is that Nicaragua has recently been amending its nationality laws and essentially stripping a lot of people who leave the country of citizenship after they leave in order so that they can't be returned to Nicaragua, and are sort of essentially rendering them stateless in that sense. So I think it's possible that, one, it's a smaller country, although there are many small countries on this list. It could be that the visa overstay rates are actually substantially different, that there's this sort of cooperation, and it could also be that you get put in a more of a bind as far as what you do with that exiled Nicaraguan population. Now there's that sort of question of statelessness. Even though they are still cooperating with the U.S. on deportations, that could possibly be part of it. But that for me, again, was part of what made this list really interesting. And again, the fact that, as you mentioned, and I'll attribute this to my colleagues at the Niskanen Center who were talking about this earlier today in a meeting, we really expected a travel ban much sooner. We really thought this was going to be something. I think a lot of people who watched immigration policy really thought that this is going to come out, much faster, and they've clearly had no real hesitation to just roll out policies and change them before either. So the fact that this list was so specific, the fact that there was a differentiation between, here's an entry ban and here are travel restrictions, and here are more specific, kinds of, caveats, etc. Leads me to believe that this was again very intentionally crafted, and they actually put a lot of thought as to how do we do something that again from a geopolitical angle is sort of in line with the administration's priorities, and perhaps also from a legal one. How does it build on Trump v. Hawaii? And how does this actually kind of sustain any future kind of legal challenge potentially? So that for me was kind of the main takeaways from the announcement.
It's yeah, I'm really glad you sort of spotlighted that specific example and sort of maybe your interpretation of the reasoning behind it, because I think it spotlights what you just mentioned, that there was a lot more thought put into this particular travel ban than the first, what, 3 or 4 versions from the first Trump administration, all of which face legal challenge. I think the latter of which was a much sort of weaker, the diet version of it. Eventually, the Trump administration won in court and was able to implement it towards the end of the administration. I think there's sort of for immigration practitioners, right? There's 2 things that we know about this travel ban right now, outside of the facts that the proclamation lays out itself. One, it's going to be challenged legally. Whether or not those legal challenges actually make a difference for foreign nationals who are going to be impacted by this, beyond the June 9th effective date that's laid out, I think that's yet to be seen, right? What even if the legal challenges are successful in potentially halting this policy from going into effect for a short period of time, I don't think that I think that there's still aspects of it that will be implemented at consulates overseas, regardless of the legal challenges, because there's virtually no oversight, right? Outside of government at what goes on at consulates overseas. And all the immigration attorneys I've been talking to since the minute, Trump got elected back in November of 2024, have been advising their clients to avoid travel, regardless of your status. If you're here on a legal visa, if you overstayed, if you have something that's pending, if you're here on asylum, to not travel outside of the U.S. Nevertheless, many have, for various reasons, and now immigration attorneys are figuring out a way to work with them. Also, for that matter, a lot of businesses require their foreign national employees to travel overseas as part of their jobs. But for various reasons, immigration attorneys have been advising against that for quite a while. And then there's a whole, group of foreign nationals who are coming over here, potentially as students, or want to come over here as students because they got accepted to a university, are coming over here to work on L visas, are coming over to visit family for a variety of different reasons, who may not be impacted by this specific travel ban, but it is not a warning shot per se, but it's a signal to them, to their companies, if they're working for a company, to their universities, and to their immigration attorneys for sure, that they need to be a lot more careful about traveling. So sort of my question to wrap up this topic, Gil, and I'm not going to ask you for a prediction because I would never force you to put a prediction down on the table, but let's call it a forecast. What's your forecast of how this particular travel ban plays out over the next 6 months, assuming legal challenges? Do you think that there are aspects of it that go into effect? Do you think that it gets expanded? What do you think happens?
Right. I think I concur with you, first that there are, aspects, of it that will go into effect. I also, again, I really wouldn't be surprised to see it expanded. I think we've really seen the administration, use this, or use immigration kind of as a pretext for retaliation, in many cases, right? So again, this is really oftentimes an incentive for countries, for example, like Nicaragua, to comply with this. Another thing that I've been watching, not to continue necessarily going back to China so much, but that is one of the areas that I study. Under the Biden administration, we had deportation flights to China resume. For the first time since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, where they rescinded cooperation on deportations as a protest for that gesture. We then had regularly scheduled deportation flights, essentially in November, December, January, and some other ones that were earlier in the year that were happening at a regular basis. To my knowledge, in tracking both sort of the open source data and the announcements that have been made, we have yet to have a deportation flight to China under the Trump administration. So that's also something that one of the criteria that has been laid out here is not cooperating with U.S. removal proceedings, especially given the number of Chinese nationals who crossed the border last year under the Biden administration. Again, to what degree does that play in? A lot of the countries I think that we saw now are, again, they're for the most part relatively small ones. They're for the most part ones that I think you can kind of pin some sort of security concern to. They're ones that are not going to necessarily massively disrupt the American economy. Some larger ones that are hostile towards us are not on there. Again, namely China and Russia. Among them, and some more minor ones, as I mentioned, Nicaragua. So I mean, they're all sort of candidates like that. And so for me, it's sort of a question. And it kind of ties into what we've seen more recently from Harvard. And I think again, both on a domestic side, what will other universities be looking at what happened to Harvard and kind of learning from that on an international scale? How will other countries be interpreting who got put on this list? And act accordingly and change their reactions and cooperation with the U.S. accordingly. I think that's going to be a pretty major signifier going forward.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, and we've learned this in the last 5 months, that like the issue of the week very much drives the policy of the next week, right?
Right.
And like you mentioned, immigration can be used, or is used by this administration probably more than any other in the past, as a tool to deal with issues that are outside of the scope of immigration, right? Be it foreign policy, trade, um, diplomacy, all sorts of other issues as well. Um, well, Gil, before we wrap up here, the last thing, and I didn't prepare you for this, so feel free to take a moment to think about it a little bit. But one question I always like to ask guests who come on this podcast in particular is, what's one issue right now, one issue or trend in the immigration space that you don't think is getting nearly enough attention by the media or by the public or by even folks like you and me and immigration practitioners who are following this stuff in the weeds?
Sure. I think for me, what's really interesting right now is looking at, there's this question. I'll try not to, ramble on too much, but we've seen, I think that the big debate before the election and before border numbers crashed was really, is the Republican argument that all you need deterrence correct, or is a Democratic argument that actually push factors matter a lot? Because if you're a Republican, you kind of think we just need strong will insurance on the border, and then numbers will crater. And to some degree, that's sort of what actually has, seemed to occur on some level. And if you were a Democrat, you believed actually there are these genuine humanitarian reasons why people are leaving Venezuela and Haiti and other countries. And, no matter what you do for deterrence, those people will still be moving. And I think so far, again, it seems like the first argument is correct, given how border numbers have gone down. But I've been looking more closely at immigration numbers from the Colombian databases. And so if you look at, just Colombia, you see, one, there are more people coming back now through the Darien Gap in reverse, which is for me is really interesting and I think has been understudied. But also there are actually more people now transiting into Colombia from Ecuador and Venezuela who are just not making it past the Darien Gap. They're now actually, all those people, it's not like these migrants who stopped coming to the border in massive numbers, just stopped arriving overnight. That's probably true, I think, of some of the nationalities from outside of the hemisphere who were really dedicated to getting just the United States, but for the ones again in say Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, it seems like many people are still leaving and are still moving, and they're just going to other countries. They're going to Colombia, they're going to Peru, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, to some degree also. And I think that's going to really reshape how we kind of view regional mobility and regional migration also, because again, those people may move again in the future. And also, we've got all these countries that are so used to just being transit countries that are not going to become destination countries. That if I had to kind of say, here's like a big trend that's going to kind of radically reshape how we view immigration regimes in the hemisphere, that's currently not getting enough attention, that would be it.
Well, Gil, I really appreciate you taking the time. It was awesome to have your perspective on this particular episode, because I do think that, you know, the folks that I normally talk with, immigration practitioners, they bring a ground level perspective that I always find very fascinating. I mean, these are immigration attorneys who literally are at court all week, who come in and say what's happening in real time at those courts. But the news of this week, especially the travel ban and the continued saga around F1 students, I think was very much helped by your broader geopolitical perspective and sort of adding in all the different components that are impacting these decisions now, and then sort of what the how they'll play out in the next couple of months. So I appreciate you
Right.
being here.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Always happy to come on and be abstract and nebulous, so anytime, I'm happy to do it.
Thanks, Gil. All right.